I learned what silence feels like long before I learned what rejection meant. It doesn't scream. It doesn't argue. It just sits there, heavy and unmoving. Like air you don't realize you're choking on until it's already too late. My first memory of it goes back to a birthday I don't even remember the age of. I remember waking up early, lying still in bed, listening for footsteps, convincing myself that maybe they were pretending to forget so they could surprise me later. That idea kept me calm for hours. Hope has a strange way of protecting you before it betrays you. I got dressed slowly that day, choosing my clothes carefully, even though no one had asked me to. I kept checking the clock, counting minutes like they meant something. Morning passed. Afternoon followed. My parents moved around the house as if it were any other day. Conversations about bills, about errands, about dinner. My name wasn't said once in a way that mattered. Each hour chipped away at that quiet belief that someone was holding something back for me. By evening, I knew. Not logically. Emotionally. There's a moment when your chest tightens and you stop waiting without consciously deciding to. That was the first time I swallowed the truth without speaking it out loud. No cake. No card. No happy birthday. Just the sound of plates clinking and the TV humming in the background while I sat there feeling like an extra piece of furniture. I told myself it was fine. I told myself birthdays weren't important. I told myself grown people don't make a big deal out of things like that. But I wasn't grown. I was a kid learning, for the first time, how to disappear without leaving the room. That pattern repeated itself year after year. Sometimes they remembered days later. Sometimes not at all. The worst part wasn't the forgetting itself. It was the casual way it happened. Like it wasn't cruel enough to be intentional, but not caring enough to be accidental either. Just indifference, clean, quiet, hard to argue with. Every year, a part of me still tried. I'd count down silently. I'd think maybe this one would be different. Maybe they'd matured. Maybe I had. Maybe love would suddenly arrive late, but arrive all the same. And every year, that hope made the fall hurt more. I learned to preempt the pain by lowering my expectations. By the time I was a teenager, I stopped telling friends when my birthday was. It was easier not to explain why nothing ever happened. It was easier to laugh it off than to admit that the people who were supposed to remember didn't. Inside, though, something was forming. A quiet narrative I didn't know I was writing. It said don't need, don't ask, don't wait. If you expect nothing, no one can take anything from you. But that story came with a cost. I stopped asking for help. Stopped sharing good news. Stopped believing my presence deserved acknowledgement. When teachers praised me, it felt awkward. When friends celebrated small wins, I didn't know how to join in. Celebration felt foreign, almost unsafe, like something that could be taken away at any moment. My parents weren't abusive. That made it harder. There was food on the table. A roof over my head. They worked hard. And that's what made the neglect confusing. Because when there's no clear villain, you start blaming yourself. You wonder if you're simply not memorable enough. Not loud enough. Not important enough to mark on a calendar. I remember one birthday in particular where my mom realized around 9 p.m. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh," she said. Just that. No rush. No panic. No guilt that lasted longer than the word itself. She said it the way someone realizes they forgot to buy milk. That stayed with me for years. It taught me something dangerous, that my milestones were optional. That my existence didn't demand interruption. That life could go on uninterrupted, even on the day I was born. From that point on, I stopped measuring love by actions and started measuring it by absence. Who didn't show up? Who didn't ask? Who didn't remember? And every year, the same two names topped the list. I became good at hiding disappointment, smiling, saying, "It's no big deal." I became the kind of person people described as low maintenance. They meant it as a compliment. I heard it as confirmation. Inside, though, birthdays turned into mirrors. Each one reflected the same message back at me: you are on your own. That realization didn't make me bitter right away. It made me quiet, watchful, independent in ways that weren't healthy yet felt necessary. I started relying on routines instead of people, on goals instead of affection, on achievement instead of attention. When you're ignored long enough, you don't explode. You contract. You fold inward until your needs take up as little space as possible. I didn't cry much. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them. I just adjusted, adapted, learned to survive the H by pretending it wasn't there. But it was always there. Every birthday became a reminder, not of age, but of distance. A quiet annual confirmation that something fundamental was missing. And the scariest part wasn't that they ignored my birthday. It was that, over time, I learned to ignore myself too. By the time I realized what I was doing, it had already become second nature. Pulling back, withdrawing, folding parts of myself inward so no one could reach them, not even by accident. Emotional withdrawal didn't arrive suddenly, it crept in quietly, disguised as independence. I told myself I was strong for not needing anyone, mature for not asking, smart for not expecting. But underneath that story was a much simpler truth. I was tired of being disappointed. I stopped sharing things that mattered to me. Not all at once, but piece by piece. First, it was the small stuff. How my day went. What made me laugh. What scared me. I learned to keep conversations safe, shallow, forgettable. Weather, work, surface, level updates that didn't invite questions. If nothing meaningful was shared, nothing meaningful could be ignored. When my parents asked how I was doing, I said, "Fine." Even when I wasn't. Especially when I wasn't. I learned that honesty required a response, and I couldn't rely on them to give one, so I protected myself by offering nothing that needed care. Over time, that habit spread beyond them: friends, teachers, partners. I became the person who listened more than they spoke, who supported everyone else while keeping their own struggles locked away. People saw me as calm, collected, low drama. What they didn't see was how carefully I curated that version of myself to avoid ever needing anything from anyone. I learned to celebrate quietly. Achievements became private moments instead of shared ones. When something good happened, my first instinct wasn't excitement, it was restraint. I'd think, don't make it a big deal. Don't draw attention. Don't set yourself up to feel small if no one responds. That restraint became a wall. A thick one. Birthdays, holidays, even ordinary milestones turned into tests I refused to take. I didn't tell people when they were coming. I didn't remind anyone. If they forgot, at least it wouldn't hurt as much if I hadn't asked them to remember. I told myself that this was dignity. That this was control. But control born from fear is still fear. There was a strange loneliness in it. Being surrounded by people yet feeling unseen, not because they refused to see me, but because I wouldn't let them. Emotional withdrawal doesn't look like isolation from the outside. It looks like competence, self-sufficiency, someone who has it together. Inside, it feels like holding your breath for years at a time. I remember moments when I almost reached out, almost told my parents how their forgetting made me feel. Almost said, "It hurts when you don't remember." But every time, another voice stopped me. A voice that sounded like experience. It said, "What if they brush it off? What if they apologize and then do it again? What if speaking only confirms that your feelings don't change anything?" So I stayed quiet. Silence became safer than vulnerability. That silence hardened into a belief: needing people is a liability. Depending on them only gives them the power to disappoint you. If you can meet your own needs, You can't be let down. But that belief came at a cost I didn't understand until much later. I stopped letting myself feel joy fully. Joy invites witnesses. Joy wants to be shared. And sharing meant risk. So I kept joy contained, muted, controlled. I also stopped letting myself feel anger. Anger demands acknowledgement. It asks for accountability. I learned early that my anger wouldn't change anything, so I swallowed it too. What you suppress doesn't disappear, it just sinks deeper. Mine turned into numbness. A flatness that made life feel manageable but dull. People praised my independence. They admired how chill I was, how I didn't seem to need reassurance or validation. They didn't realize that this wasn't confidence. It was armor, heavy, invisible armor that I wore everywhere. At home, my parents didn't notice the distance growing between us. Or maybe they did and didn't know what to do with it. Either way, the gap widened. Conversations became transactional, practical, schedules, responsibilities. There was no space for emotion because I no longer made space for it. I trained myself not to hope. Hope is dangerous when it's not met. So I stopped imagining better outcomes, stopped picturing surprise parties or heartfelt apologies. I learned to expect the bare minimum and call it peace. But the human heart doesn't stop wanting just because the mind tells it to. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I felt it. The ache. The question that never quite went away: what would it feel like to be chosen without asking? Those moments scared me more than the disappointment ever did. Wanting something I didn't know how to ask for felt like standing on unstable ground. So I doubled down on self-reliance. I told myself I didn't need emotional closeness, that I was better off alone. Emotional withdrawal also taught me how to disappear in relationships. I stayed longer than I should have in situations that didn't serve me because leaving felt like asking for something better, and asking had never gone well for me. I accepted crumbs because at least crumbs were certain. I became skilled at being the strong one. The reliable one, the one who didn't crack. But strength without softness becomes isolation. And isolation, even when chosen, still hurts. The hardest part is this: I didn't realize how far I'd pulled away until I tried to step back in. Until I wanted to be seen and realized I didn't know how to show myself anymore. Emotional withdrawal had kept me safe, but it had also kept me invisible. I wasn't just withdrawing from my parents. I was withdrawing from my own needs. And I didn't yet know that one day, all that unspoken distance would demand to be acknowledged. At some point, survival stopped being about getting through the day and started being about building something no one could take away from me. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to chase money or success. It happened gradually, almost accidentally, as if my life leaned in that direction on its own. When you learn early that emotional support is unreliable, you start looking for something that feels solid, predictable, measurable. For me, that became work. I started by saying yes to everything: extra hours, extra responsibilities, projects no one else wanted. Not because I loved them, but because staying busy kept my mind from wandering into places that hurt. Work didn't forget me. Deadlines didn't ignore me. Effort had a return, and that alone felt comforting. While other people spent their energy trying to be noticed, I focused on becoming necessary. There's safety in being useful. When you make yourself valuable, you don't have to ask to be included. You're automatically needed. That idea shaped the way I moved through the world. I watched carefully, learned how systems worked, how people got ahead. I studied not just my job, but the people above me, how they spoke, what they prioritized, what they sacrificed. I didn't have a mentor cheering me on, so I became my own. I learned to motivate myself because no one else was going to do it consistently. Every small win felt like a quiet reassurance. A paycheck that grew a little bigger. a responsibility entrusted to me, a compliment from someone who didn't know my history and didn't need to. These moments didn't fill the emotional gap, but they covered it. Like placing boards over a crack in the floor so you wouldn't fall through. I kept my progress to myself. Not out of secrecy but habit. I was used to moving alone. Telling my parents about promotions or raises felt unnecessary, almost uncomfortable. They had never been part of that world for me, so I didn't invite them in. I convinced myself that sharing would feel awkward, and I didn't like awkwardness. There was also a deeper reason. Part of me didn't want to risk indifference again. I imagined telling them something big and watching it land flat. That image was enough to keep my mouth closed. So I let them believe I was doing fine. Nothing more. Nothing less. Money became a form of language I understood. You put in effort, you get results. You plan, you save, you grow. It was honest in a way people weren't. It didn't pretend. It didn't forget. It responded directly to what you gave it. I wasn't reckless. Every dollar had a purpose. Every expense was considered. I learned restraint early, not because I was disciplined by nature, but because uncertainty had taught me caution. Having savings felt like having a safety net I could trust. It didn't care whether it was my birthday or not. It was just there. As my income grew, so did my confidence, but it was a specific kind of confidence. Not loud, not flashy. Quiet, internal, the kind that says, I'll be okay no matter what happens. That feeling was addictive. It made me feel anchored in a way I never had before. There were nights when I worked late and felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. I'd sit alone, looking at the progress I'd made, and think about how far I'd come without anyone noticing. There was sadness in that thought, but also power. I had built something in silence. I had proven to myself that I didn't need permission to grow. Survival mode doesn't ask whether you're happy. It asks whether you're safe, and for a long time, this version of life felt safe. I had control. I had direction. I had momentum. I wasn't at the mercy of anyone's attention or memory. But survival has a way of becoming identity if you're not careful. I didn't just work hard. I avoided stillness. Stillness left too much room for reflection. And reflection brought questions I wasn't ready to answer. Questions about loneliness. About why success felt good but not complete. About why every achievement came with a quiet echo instead of celebration. I told myself that this was the trade-off. That independence meant solitude. That self-reliance meant not being witnessed. I accepted it because it felt familiar. Discomfort I understood was better than hope I didn't. Even as my bank account grew, I kept my lifestyle modest. Not because I couldn't afford more, but because excess felt risky. Drawing attention felt unsafe. I didn't want to invite questions or expectations. I wanted my life to be stable, not impressive. There were moments, though, when I caught myself imagining what it would be like to share it. To sit across from my parents and tell them what I'd accomplished. To watch their faces change with pride or surprise. Those thoughts came and went quickly. I dismissed them as fantasies, too fragile to rely on. What I didn't realize then was that survival mode was preparing me for something else. It was building not just financial security, but emotional distance. The more self-sufficient I became, the less space there was for anyone else to claim credit or control. I was constructing a life that didn't require approval. And yet, beneath all of it, there was still a quiet hope. Not that they would suddenly change, but that one day they would see me. Really see me. Not the quiet child who asked for nothing, but the adult who built something out of neglect. I didn't know when that day would come. I just knew that if it did, I wanted to be standing on solid ground when it happened. The realization didn't arrive with fireworks or applause. It came quietly, On a morning that felt ordinary in every way except one, I woke up without that familiar weight in my chest. No countdown in my head. No waiting. No checking my phone. For the first time, my birthday felt like just another day, and instead of sadness, there was clarity. I understood something I had been circling for years without naming it. I wasn't chasing success to prove anything to my parents. I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't even trying to be seen. I was building a life because I needed one that didn't collapse when people forgot me. That understanding changed the way I saw everything. All those late nights, all the discipline, all the restraint. It wasn't bitterness driving me. It was preservation. I had learned, early and painfully, that relying on emotional consistency from others left me exposed, so I built consistency into my environment instead. Structure, goals, numbers that went up when I showed up. I realized that what I had created wasn't just financial stability. It was distance. Healthy distance. The kind that allows you to breathe without waiting for permission. For years, I thought independence meant doing everything alone. But standing there, brushing my teeth that morning, it finally hit me that independence actually meant something else. It meant not needing validation to move forward. Not needing acknowledgement to feel whole. It meant choosing myself without resentment. That shift was subtle, but powerful. I stopped imagining conversations where my parents suddenly understood me. I stopped replaying old moments, wondering what I could have said differently. I stopped carrying invisible arguments with people who didn't even know they were part of them. There was grief in that realization. You don't let go of expectations without mourning them first. I had to accept that my parents were never going to give me the version of love I kept hoping for. Not because they were evil or cruel, but because they simply didn't know how. That truth hurt less than pretending otherwise. And in that acceptance, something loosened inside me. I began to see my life as my own story, not a reaction to theirs. My work wasn't a rebellion. My savings weren't a statement. My progress wasn't a message waiting to be decoded. It was just me, moving forward. The idea of buying the Porsche didn't come from a place of impulse. It wasn't about showing off or filling a void. It came from a calm, grounded thought: I've earned this. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, undeniable way. I ran the numbers carefully. I thought about it for weeks. I asked myself hard questions. Was this aligned with who I was, or who I used to be? Was this about ego or appreciation? Every time, the answer surprised me with its steadiness. This wasn't about them. That was the turning point. For the first time, a major decision in my life had nothing to do with proving resilience, or compensating for neglect, or protecting myself from disappointment. It was simply an acknowledgement of effort. A marker of a chapter completed. When I signed the papers, there was no rush of adrenaline. Just a sense of completion. Like closing a book you'd been reading for years. Driving it for the first time felt surreal, not because of the car itself, but because of what it represented internally. I wasn't escaping anything. I wasn't running. I was arriving. And yet, even in that moment, I didn't think about my parents. Not once. That's how I knew something had truly changed. The old version of me would have imagined their reaction, would have pictured shock, regret, maybe pride. This version of me didn't need that scene to exist. My sense of worth wasn't tied to their response anymore. That realization brought a strange peace, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just settles. I noticed how differently I carried myself after that. Less guarded, less rigid, still disciplined but not defensive. I wasn't building walls anymore. I was choosing boundaries. Boundaries don't come from anger. They come from clarity. I stopped explaining myself unnecessarily. Stopped shrinking my accomplishments to make others comfortable. I didn't inflate them either. I just let them exist. There was also a softness that returned, a willingness to enjoy things without guilt, to celebrate quietly, to acknowledge progress without immediately bracing for disappointment. For years, my life had been shaped by what I lacked. Now it was shaped by what I had built. The irony wasn't lost on me. The thing I once thought I needed from my parents, recognition, validation, care, I had learned to give myself. And once I did, their absence no longer defined me. That didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped waiting. The turning point wasn't the car. It was the moment I realized I didn't need a witness to feel real. That my journey mattered even if no one clapped. That success didn't require an audience to be legitimate. And with that realization came a quiet confidence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that doesn't fear it either. I didn't know then how this shift would ripple outward, how it would change conversations, how it would expose truths that had been buried under years of silence. I only knew that something irreversible had happened inside me. I had crossed a line, from surviving to choosing, from waiting to living, from hoping to knowing, and nothing, not even their eventual reaction, could take that away from me. I didn't plan the exposure the way people imagine these moments happening. There was no dramatic speech rehearsed in my head, no calculated entrance meant to shock anyone. In fact, I almost didn't go over at all. I sat in the car for a long time after starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling that old instinct rise up, the instinct to avoid, to disappear, to keep everything contained. A part of me wanted to turn around and drive somewhere quiet, somewhere anonymous, where no one knew me well enough to misunderstand my silence. But something else pushed me forward. Not anger, not pride, just a steady pull toward truth. When I pulled into their driveway, the sound of the engine felt louder than it should have. The car didn't belong there. It looked out of place against the familiar, slightly worn surroundings. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. How contrast has a way of exposing things that routine keeps hidden. I didn't announce myself. I didn't text. I didn't honk. I just sat there for a moment, breathing, reminding myself that whatever happened next didn't define me. It would only reveal what was already there. The front door opened the way it always did. Slowly, casually. My dad stepped out first, and I watched his expression change in stages. Confusion, suspicion, then something sharper, recognition mixed with disbelief. His eyes moved from the car to me, back to the car again, as if trying to reconcile two realities that didn't fit together. My mom followed him. She stopped short when she saw it. I could almost hear the mental math happening. The questions stacking up behind her eyes. That was the first time I'd ever seen panic on her face because of me. "What is this?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. I answered simply, "It's mine." The word hung there, heavy and unprotected. They both started talking at once. Questions spilling out, overlapping, urgent in a way I wasn't used to hearing from them. "How did you afford this? When did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? Are you in trouble? Is this a lease?" Alone, I stood there quietly letting it happen. For once, I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't minimize. I didn't soften the truth to make it easier to swallow. I just let them see the gap, the years they'd missed, the life they hadn't noticed forming right in front of them. That's when it hit me. The panic wasn't about the car. It was about control, about realizing they didn't have a clear picture of my life anymore. That they hadn't been consulted. That they hadn't been informed. That they weren't part of this chapter. My dad laughed nervously, trying to bring things back to familiar ground. "You should have told us," he said, like it was a mild oversight. I looked at him and felt something shift again. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. You didn't ask, I said. The silence that followed was different from the ones I'd grown up with. This one wasn't dismissive. It was unsettled. It forced everyone in it to sit with discomfort instead of ignoring it. My mom tried to recover quickly. She smiled, reached out, touched my arm like she was re-establishing connection. We just didn't know, she said softly. And there it was. The sentence that explained everything without meaning to. They didn't know because they hadn't been paying attention. I felt the urge to explain myself rise up, the old reflex to justify, to fill the space with context and backstory. Years ago, I would have done it. I would have walked them through every step, hoping understanding would finally earn me something I'd been missing. But standing there, I realized something else. They weren't asking because they cared about my journey. They were asking because the outcome surprised them. That distinction mattered. My mom asked how long I'd been doing well. I thought about all the birthdays, all the quiet milestones, all the moments I'd celebrated alone. I thought about how easy it would be to say, not that long, just to keep things comfortable. Instead, I told the truth. For years, I said. Her face changed again, not panic this time, something closer to guilt, or maybe shock at realizing how much time had passed without her noticing. My dad asked why I never mentioned any of it. His tone wasn't accusing, but it wasn't curious either. It was defensive, like the question itself was protection against what the answer might imply. I didn't answer right away. I looked at them, really looked at them, and saw people who weren't prepared to confront the quiet consequences of their inattention. People who thought love could exist without effort, as long as nothing visibly broke. You forgot my birthday, I said finally. Again, it came out calm, not dramatic, not emotional, just factual. The words landed harder than I expected. My mom blinked rapidly. My dad looked down at the ground. That's not. My mom started, then stopped. I didn't press. I didn't list examples. I didn't build a case. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require reinforcement anymore. In that moment, the exposure was complete. Not because I'd said something cruel or revealing, but because the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was had become undeniable. They were looking at a version of me they didn't help shape, didn't support, didn't even notice. The car was just the evidence. My mom tried to hug me. I let her. It felt awkward, unfamiliar, like trying to reconnect a muscle that hadn't been used in years. My dad started explaining. Work stress. Time passing too fast. Not meaning to forget, I listened without interrupting. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I didn't take responsibility for making them feel better. For once, I didn't carry the emotional weight of the moment for everyone else. That was new. When I eventually left, I noticed how quiet the drive felt. Not empty, clear. The exposure hadn't given me closure the way people talk about it. It hadn't magically fixed anything. But it had shifted the balance. They had seen me. Not in the way I once hoped for, but in the way that mattered now. And for the first time, that was enough. After that day, the world didn't change all at once. There was no sudden transformation, no perfect apology, no dramatic rebuilding of what had been missing for so long. What changed instead was quieter, deeper, and far more permanent. I drove away from their house and realized something that startled me with its simplicity. I wasn't carrying their reaction with me. It stayed behind, right there in the driveway, where it belonged. For most of my life, moments like that would have echoed in my head for days. Every word replayed, every look analyzed. I would have wondered if I'd been too harsh, too cold, too distant. I would have shrunk myself afterward, softened the truth, reached out first to repair discomfort that wasn't mine to fix. This time, I didn't. The silence in my car wasn't heavy. It was spacious. It felt like breathing room I'd never had before. I noticed things I usually didn't. The steady hum of the engine. The way the light shifted as the sun dipped lower, the calm in my own chest. It struck me then how much emotional energy I'd spent my entire life managing other people's feelings, especially my parents'. I'd been carrying responsibility that was never assigned to me, just assumed. That realization stayed with me in the days that followed. My parents called more after that. Not constantly, but noticeably more than before. The conversations were different, careful, measured. There was an awkwardness there, a sense that they were trying to understand where they stood now. Part of me recognized the effort. Another part knew that effort doesn't erase years of absence. It only acknowledges them. And for the first time, I didn't rush to meet them where they were. I let the distance exist without trying to fill it. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I began to understand that freedom doesn't come from confrontation alone. It comes from deciding what you no longer need to carry. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head, stopped preparing justifications for my choices. I didn't owe anyone a simplified version of my life to make it easier for them to digest. That was a powerful shift. I also noticed how my relationship with myself changed. I no longer felt the urge to downplay my achievements when I thought of my parents. Their approval had quietly stepped down from its position of importance. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like realizing you'd been gripping something tightly for years and your hand could finally relax. There was grief in that too. Letting go of the hope that one day they'd fully see me the way I once needed them to meant accepting that some wounds don't close the way we imagine. They scar instead, but scars don't age the way open wounds do. They tell a story without demanding constant attention. I started celebrating my life differently after that. Birthdays became intentional instead of reactive. I planned things I enjoyed, invited people who showed up consistently, and let myself enjoy the day without waiting for anyone to validate it. There was a quiet joy in that, a grounded kind of happiness that didn't spike or crash. The consequences of the exposure weren't punishment for my parents. They were clarity for me. I stopped bending my life around their blind spots. I stopped interpreting their limitations as personal failures. I saw them more clearly than ever before. Flawed human, emotionally distant, but no longer powerful over my sense of worth. That didn't mean I cut them off. It meant I stopped chasing something they couldn't give. There's a difference. I could be present without being dependent, kind without being self-sacrificing, honest without being confrontational. The biggest consequence, though, was internal. I trusted myself more. I trusted my decisions, my instincts, my ability to navigate discomfort without abandoning myself. I realized that the strength I'd built during years of neglect wasn't just for survival. It was for discernment. I could choose what stayed in my life and what didn't, without guilt. That trust extended into other relationships too. I noticed I no longer tolerated one-sided effort. I stopped over-explaining. Stopped trying to earn space in rooms where I already belonged. I recognized emotional availability when I saw it, and I walked away when it wasn't there. The freedom that came from that was subtle, but expansive. It felt like standing upright after years of hunching forward, bracing for impact that never quite came, but was always expected. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the younger version of me. The one who waited quietly, counting minutes, hoping for acknowledgement. I don't feel anger toward my parents when I think of that kid anymore. I feel compassion. For myself. For how much I carried without knowing I didn't have to. If I could speak to that version of me now, I wouldn't promise that things get perfect. I'd tell them something more honest and more useful. I'd say, one day, you'll stop waiting. One day, you'll realize that being overlooked didn't make you invisible. It made you observant, resilient, capable of building a life that doesn't depend on being remembered by the wrong people. The panic my parents felt when they saw the Porsche faded quickly. Life went back to its routines, but the consequence that mattered most stayed with me. I no longer measured myself by their attention. I no longer anchored my identity to their recognition. I was free to be whole without an audience. And that freedom didn't come from money, or success, or even confrontation. It came from finally understanding that my worth had never been negotiable, even when it went unacknowledged. That understanding changed the way I move through the world. It still does.